Everyone laughed at the obese girl in the cage, thinking she was just a sideshow freak, good for a cruel laugh and a handful of coins. But when a mountain man asked to buy her, the town went dead, silent. Folks thought it was a joke. He wasn't laughing. He was carrying a signed paper and a promise no man could break. What they didn't know? That girl held the last living claim to the land under their boots, and the water running through their wells. While the crowd jeered, one man saw chains made of greed, pride, and a town's darkest secret. But paper burns, and power doesn't change hands without a fight. When the dust settles and the cage is empty, this town will face a reckoning. Before we dive into today's story, I'd love to know where you are watching from. Seeing your comments really reminds me why I do this every day. The morning sun blazed overhead as the dusty streets of Sagebrush Flats stirred with unusual activity. Townsfolk emerged from their homes and shops, drawn by the commotion of wagon wheels and coarse shouts. The traveling medicine show was setting up, but it wasn't snake oil or miracle tonics drawing the growing crowd today. A wooden cage, crude and splintered, bounced roughly across the rutted street. Burlap sheets draped its sides, barely concealing the massive figure within. Two rough hands yanked the cage forward with thick ropes, while a red-faced man in a stained vest strutted alongside, calling out to gathering onlookers. "Step right up. Place your bets. How much you reckon the hog maid weighs?" The man's voice carried the sour smell of last night's whiskey. "2 bits gets you a guess. Winner takes home $5. From the edge of the growing crowd, Eli Booker stood silent and still as stone. His weathered hands gripped his walking staff, knuckles white with tension. His eyes never left the cage as it settled in the town square with a heavy thud. "Pa, please," came a soft voice from behind the burlap. "I don't want to do this anymore." "Shut your trap!" The man in the vest yanked away one side of the burlap, revealing Rosalie crouched inside. She blinked against the harsh sunlight, trying to make herself smaller despite her size. Cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. "Look at the size of her. Ain't natural for a girl to be that big. Bet she eats more than my prize hog." Someone threw a half-eaten apple that bounced off the cage bars. Others followed with scraps and jeers, their faces twisted with a mean kind of joy. Rosalie pressed herself against the far side of the cage, her shoulders shaking. Eli's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough. His boots kicked up dust as he pushed through the crowd, ignoring the mutters and sideways glances. The walking staff thumped against packed earth with each deliberate step until he stood before the cage. $5, Eli said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife through butter. "And a full jug of whiskey." The laughter died. Rosalie's father turned, squinting at Eli with bloodshot eyes. "What's that you say?" "You heard me?" Eli reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, smoothing it against the cage bars. "Got the guardianship papers right here, already filled out. Just needs your mark." A heavy silence fell over the square. The crowd pressed closer, hungry for this unexpected drama. Rosalie's father swayed slightly, looking from Eli to the paper and back again. "You want to buy her?" He jabbed a thumb toward the cage, disbelief thick in his voice. "That's right." Eli's expression remained unchanged as he produced a leather pouch and a clay jug from his coat. The coins clinked as he set them on top of the paper. Someone in the crowd snickered. Another whispered, "The old mountain man's gone soft in the head." Rosalie's father picked up the jug, uncorked it, and took a long sniff. His eyes widened at the quality of the whiskey. He hefted the pouch of coins, feeling their weight. "What's your game, old man?" he demanded, but Eli could see the greed already working in the man's eyes. "What you want with a useless girl like that?" "My business is my own," Eli replied evenly. "Do we have a deal?" The crowd held its breath. Rosalie pressed against the bars, her eyes fixed on Eli with a desperate kind of hope. Her father looked around at the assembled faces, then back at the whiskey and coins in his hands. Something ugly flickered across his features. Might be worth more than that, showing her around, he said, trying to sound clever. Medicine show pays good for oddities. Might be, Eli agreed calmly. But then again, might be the sheriff would be interested in hearing about how you come by those land deeds you've been selling up north. He let that hang in the air between them. Your choice. The color drained from the other man's face. His mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he snatched up the guardianship paper. With shaking hands, he scrawled his mark at the bottom. Take her then, he spat, fumbling with the cage lock. Good riddance to bad fortune. The crowd murmured as the cage door swung open. Rosalie hesitated, looking uncertainly between her father and Eli. The mountain man extended his hand, weathered and steady. Come on, girl, he said quietly. Time to go home. Need witnesses for this to be proper, Eli announced, his voice carrying across the square. He scanned the crowd, eyes settling on familiar faces. Preacher McKinley, Tom Barnes, you'll do. The blacksmith and circuit preacher stepped forward, their boots scuffing through the morning dust. Tom Barnes wiped his soot-stained hands on his leather apron, while Preacher McKinley adjusted his worn collar, both men positioning themselves on either side of the makeshift transaction. Rosalie's father swayed, still clutching the whiskey jug. Already signed it, didn't I? Need to do this right and legal? Eli insisted, producing a brass-capped ink pen from his vest pocket. The morning sun caught the worn metal as he unscrewed the cap. Put your full name this time, right there. He pointed to a clean line beneath the scrawled mark. The crowd pressed closer, necks craning to see. Eli spread the document against a nearby barrel, smoothing its creased corners. The paper's official letterhead drew whispers from those close enough to read it. That's Judge Morrison's seal, someone muttered. From the territorial court? Rosalie's father squinted at the document, his bloodshot eyes widening as he recognized the embossed mark. His hand trembled slightly as he scratched out his name, Samuel Tucker, in uneven letters. Your turn, gentlemen, Eli said to the witnesses. The blacksmith signed first, his huge hands surprisingly delicate with the pen. Preacher McKinley added his signature with a flourish, then stepped back with a small nod of approval. A sharp voice cut through the murmuring crowd. This is highly irregular. Elder Horace Graves pushed through the onlookers, his black coat immaculate despite the dusty morning. His thin lips pressed together as he surveyed the scene, pausing to straighten his silver watch chain. A man's property cannot simply be stolen away through legal trickery, Graves continued, his words dripping with false concern, even with the pretense of paperwork. Ain't stealing what's being sold willing, Eli replied evenly. He turned to the cage where Rosalie still huddled, her eyes wide with uncertainty. Come on out now, girl. You're free of this. Rosalie crawled forward on trembling legs. Her dress was stained and torn, her dark hair tangled from the rough journey. She stumbled slightly as she emerged, unused to standing straight after hours cramped in the cage. Without hesitation, Eli shrugged off his heavy wool coat and draped it over her shoulders, shielding her from the crowd's stares. This transaction cannot stand, Elder Graves declared, his voice rising. The girl clearly has no say in this matter, and what of her mother's people? Their claim must surely... He stopped abruptly as Eli turned to face him. Funny you should mention that claim, Eli said quietly. The morning breeze carried his words across the suddenly silent square. Seeing as how Rosalie here holds the last valid tribal water rights to Cottonwood Creek, papers signed by her grandmother before the territory was even mapped. He paused, letting that sink in. Same creek that feeds this whole valley. Same creek you've been selling water rights to. Ain't that right, Elder? The color drained from Graves's face. Around them, the crowd's mood shifted like wind before a storm. Confused glances were exchanged. Someone whispered about drought years and well rights. A farmer in the back cursed softly. Lies and slander, Graves managed, but his voice had lost its authority. Those claims were settled years ago. Might want to check them records again, Eli suggested. He turned back to Rosalie, who stood straighter now despite her fear. Time we were going, girl. Got a long ride ahead. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the square as Eli led Rosalie to where his mule cart waited. The crowd parted silently, their earlier cruelty replaced by uncertain fears about their own homesteads and water access. Even Elder Graves stood frozen, his carefully maintained world of power threatening to unravel. Eli helped Rosalie onto the wooden seat, making sure his coat stayed wrapped around her shoulders. The mule's harness jingled softly as he checked the straps one final time. Behind them, Rosalie's father had already disappeared into the saloon with his whiskey, leaving the empty cage as the only evidence of the morning's events. Without another word to the watching town, Eli clucked to his mule, and the cart began rolling toward the outskirts of Sagebrush Flats. Dust rose behind their wheels as they headed west, toward the line shack that sat 2 miles out where the prairie met the foothills. The sun sank lower, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, as town and townsfolk faded into the growing dusk. The mule cart rattled over uneven ground, jostling Rosalie as she perched uncertainly on the wooden seat. Her hands gripped the edge of the bench, knuckles white with tension. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the sagebrush, and dust clouds billowed behind their wheels, coating everything in a fine powder. Eli sat beside her, his weathered hands steady on the reins. He hadn't spoken since they left town, but his silence felt different from the cruel quiet she knew from the cage. The vast emptiness of the prairie stretched around them, broken only by scattered rocks and twisted juniper trees. The cart hit another bump, and Rosalie swayed precariously. Eli's arm shot out, steadying her before she could fall. He didn't comment on the save, just reached into his trail bag with his free hand and pulled out a cloth-wrapped package. "Reckon you're hungry," he said, unwrapping a thick slice of cornbread. "Ain't much, but it'll hold you till supper." Rosalie stared at the offered food, not daring to reach for it. In her experience, kindness always came with strings attached, but her stomach growled loudly, betraying her hunger. "Go on," Eli encouraged, his voice gruff but gentle. "Ain't poisoned or nothing." With trembling fingers, she took the cornbread. The first bite was small, tentative. When nothing bad happened, she devoured the rest in quick, desperate bites. Eli pretended not to notice, keeping his eyes on the trail ahead. The sun was setting when they crested a small rise. Below them sat a modest line shack, its weathered boards silvered by years of sun and wind. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a stack of split wood leaned against the north wall. "Home," Eli said simply, guiding the mule down the slope. Rosalie's eyes widened as they drew closer. The shack was tiny compared to the buildings in town, but it had real walls and a proper door. No bars, no cage. The vastness of the open prairie pressed in around her, making her dizzy with possibilities. Eli helped her down from the cart, then unhitched the mule with practiced efficiency. "Let's get inside before dark," he said, gathering his supplies. "Nights get cold out here." The shack's interior was spare but tidy. A narrow bed occupied one corner, its quilt patched but clean. A pot-bellied stove squatted in the center, while rough-hewn shelves held basic provisions. A kerosene lamp hung from a ceiling beam. "First thing is light," Eli explained, reaching for the lamp. "Watch close now, this here's important." He demonstrated how to trim the wick and light it properly, his movements slow and deliberate. "Your turn," he said, offering her the matches. Rosalie's hands shook as she struck the match, but she managed to light the lamp without incident. The warm glow filled the small space, pushing back the gathering darkness. "Good," Eli nodded. "Now for the fire." He showed her how to lay kindling in the stove, explaining each step. When flames caught and began crackling, pride flickered across Rosalie's face before she quickly hid it. Supper was simple. Beans warmed on the stove, more cornbread, and coffee that Eli insisted she sweeten with precious sugar. They ate in silence, but Rosalie couldn't stop glancing at the door. No locks, no guards, just a simple latch she could lift herself if she wanted. The freedom was terrifying. As Eli cleared their tin plates, Rosalie finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" Eli paused, studying her with tired eyes. "Nothing you don't want to give." "Everyone wants something," she insisted, years of harsh experience evident in her tone. "Reckon that's true enough," Eli admitted, settling into his chair. "I want you to be safe. Want you to learn to read proper, maybe help with the trap lines come winter." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But them's just hopes, not demands. Mercy ain't something you pay back." Rosalie's breath caught at that. She searched his face for signs of deception, but found only weathered honesty. Tears welled in her eyes, and she quickly looked away. "There's a proper bed for you," Eli continued, gesturing to the narrow cot. "I'll sleep out in the lean-to till we can build proper walls for a second room. Got some old clothes might fit you after washing. We'll sort it all tomorrow." He stood, gathering his bedroll. "Latch works from inside," he added quietly. "Use it or don't. Your choice." Rosalie watched him duck through the door, unable to form words around the lump in her throat. When she was alone, she touched the latch experimentally, testing its reality. Then she moved to the small window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. The first night in years she'd seen it without bars in the way. The vastness of it all overwhelmed her, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, fear wasn't her strongest feeling. Something else was taking root. Something that felt dangerously like hope. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the prairie in soft golden light. Eli found Rosalie already awake, sitting rigid on the edge of her bed. She jumped when he knocked on the doorframe, though she tried to hide it. "Time to learn the morning chores," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Water comes first." Outside, dew sparkled on the sagebrush as they walked to the well. The wooden bucket sat ready, rope coiled beside it. Eli demonstrated the proper way to lower it, the rope rough against his calloused hands. "Drought's been hard this summer," he explained, as the bucket took longer than usual to splash into water. Tables dropped near 3 feet since spring. He showed her how to test the rope's tension to know when the bucket was full, then let her try. Rosalie's first attempt sent the bucket crashing against the well's stone sides. She flinched at the noise, but Eli just nodded encouragingly. "That's normal. Try again, slower this time." Her second try went better. When she finally hauled up a full bucket, drops of water catching the morning light as they dripped from the rim, a tiny smile flickered across her face. "Good," Eli said. "Now for the wood." Behind the cabin, Eli demonstrated proper axe handling with the smaller pieces of wood. "Kindling's important as the big logs," he explained. "Can't start a fire without the little stuff." Rosalie's attempts were clumsy, her oversized hands struggling with the unfamiliar tool. But she kept at it, determination evident in the set of her jaw. When she finally split a piece cleanly, Eli noticed her straighten slightly, pride warring with her habitual stoop. After breakfast, Eli pulled out a worn Bible, its leather cover smooth from years of handling. "Reading starts with knowing your letters," he said, opening to Psalm 23. "My daughter—" He paused, swallowing hard. She always said this was the easiest place to start. Rosalie traced the letters with one finger, mouthing the shapes silently. "The Lord is my shepherd," Eli read slowly, pointing to each word. "I shall not want." They worked through the familiar verses, Rosalie struggling but persistent. The morning passed quietly, broken only by the sound of her careful pronunciation and Eli's patient corrections. As they finished a simple midday stew, hoofbeats approached the cabin. Eli's hand moved instinctively toward his rifle, but he forced it back to his spoon when he recognized Deputy Walt Klein's dun horse. The deputy's boot heels clicked against the packed earth as he dismounted. His badge caught the sun as he straightened his vest, trying to look important, despite the dust coating his clothes. Eli Booker? Klein called out, not bothering to remove his hat. Got a summons here from the town council. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, holding it out like it might bite. Regarding the girl's claim. Eli took the paper without comment, noting the official seal. Council meets tomorrow at noon, Klein added, his eyes sliding to where Rosalie had shrunk back into the cabin's shadows. Elder Graves expects you both there. His tone made it clear this wasn't a request. We'll come, Eli said simply. Klein lingered, clearly hoping for more reaction, but Eli just stood silently until the deputy remounted and rode away. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the prairie, Rosalie helped Eli clean their supper dishes. Her movements were careful, as if she expected the tin plates to shatter at her touch. Why? She finally whispered, not looking up from her work. Why bother with someone like me? I ain't worth all this trouble? Eli set down the cup he was drying, considering his words carefully. Had a daughter once, he said finally, his voice rough. Sarah. Fever took her. Winter of '68. I was too proud to ask for help, thought I could cure her myself. He ran a hand over his face, remembering. By the time I swallowed my pride and rode for the doctor, it was too late. Rosalie had gone very still, listening. Sometimes, Eli continued, the good Lord gives us second chances, not to fix what's broken, but to do better next time. He looked at her directly. You ain't worthless, girl. Never was. Just needed someone to see it. Rosalie's hands trembled as she set down the plate she was holding. A tear slid down her cheek, falling silently to the wooden floor. I keep thinking I'll wake up back in that cage, she admitted, her voice barely audible. You won't, Eli promised. That part of your life is over. Tomorrow at the council meeting, we face whatever comes together. He picked up another dish, his movements deliberate and steady. You ain't alone anymore. Rosalie nodded, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. When she reached for the next plate, her hands were steadier, and she stood a little straighter. In the soft evening light, something new showed in her face. The first fragile bloom of self-worth, taking root like a wildflower in spring. Morning mist clung to the sagebrush as Eli hitched the mule to his cart. Rosalie emerged from the cabin wearing the clean dress they'd found in a trunk. One of Sarah's old ones, though neither mentioned it. The fabric strained at the seams, but it was better than the rags she'd worn in the cage. Ready? Eli asked, offering his hand to help her up. Rosalie nodded, her face set with quiet determination as she climbed aboard. The cart creaked under her weight but held steady. Eli clucked to the mule, and they set off toward town. The sun burned away the last wisps of fog as they approached Sagebrush Flats. Already, townsfolk lined the boardwalks, watching their approach with undisguised hostility. Women pulled their children closer. Men spat in the dust. Hold your head up, Eli murmured. You've got as much right to be here as any of them. Rosalie straightened slightly, though her hands twisted nervously in her lap. The cart's wheels echoed against the packed dirt of Main Street as they made their way to the white-painted church that served as the town hall. Inside, the pews were already filled with what seemed like half the town. Elder Graves stood at the pulpit, his black suit pristine despite the summer heat. Beside him sat Theodore Mills, the town's banker, shuffling through papers with an air of practiced importance. Eli helped Rosalie down from the cart and led her inside. The crowd's whispers followed them like angry wasps. They took seats in the front row, where they couldn't miss the contempt in Elder Graves's eyes. This council meeting will come to order, Graves intoned, bringing down his gavel. We are here to address the matter of a supposed land claim brought forward by Eli Booker on behalf of his... He paused meaningfully. Ward? The banker rose, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles. The documentation Mr. Booker presented yesterday appears irregular, Mills announced. The claim relies on hereditary rights through the girl's mother, but we have no proof of such lineage. The papers are legitimate, Eli said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. He pulled the carefully preserved documents from his coat, signed and witnessed by the Indian agent himself in '62. Elder Graves' lips thinned. Without the mother present to verify the bloodline, these papers are worthless. He looked down at Rosalie with calculated disdain. We have only your word that this person has any connection to the original claimant. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. But something had changed. Where before they'd jeered openly at Rosalie, now they cast uneasy glances her way. She sat, straight-backed in her chair, her eyes fixed steadily ahead. No longer a spectacle in a cage, she had become something they couldn't quite dismiss. The law's clear, Eli countered. Hereditary rights pass to surviving children. Rosalie's claim is valid. The law also requires proof, Mills shot back. Where are your witnesses? Where is anyone who knew the mother? Where is any evidence beyond convenient papers that could have been stolen or forged? A few townspeople shifted uncomfortably at this suggestion. They'd known Eli for years as an honest man, if a solitary one. But with their own water rights potentially at stake, doubt came easier than trust. Elder Graves brought down his gavel again. This council demands proper verification of the girl's lineage, he declared. You have 3 days to produce supporting witnesses. If you cannot, he smiled thinly. The claim will be nullified, and appropriate charges may be filed regarding attempted fraud. 3 days ain't much time to gather witnesses, Eli observed quietly. Then I suggest you ride fast, Mr. Booker. Graves' smile didn't reach his eyes. This meeting is adjourned. The crowd began to file out, their hostile murmurs building. Eli helped Rosalie to her feet, noting how she trembled slightly despite her composed expression. They walked back to the cart through a gauntlet of dark looks and muttered threats. Trying to steal honest folks' water rights, someone called out. Ain't natural, taking her side against decent people, another voice added. Eli lifted Rosalie into the cart, then climbed up beside her. The mule's hooves kicked up dust as they pulled away from the church, the weight of the town's anger pressing against their backs. They were nearly at the edge of town when Elder Graves' voice rang out from the church steps. 3 days, Booker. Not 1 hour more. Eli didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. While beside him, Rosalie sat silent but unbowed, no longer the broken creature they'd freed from the cage, just days before. Back at the line shack, Eli paced the worn floorboards while Rosalie cleared their lunch dishes. The afternoon sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the table where the council summons lay like a snake ready to strike. 3 days, Eli muttered, running a weathered hand through his gray-streaked hair. Ain't much time, but I reckon I know someone who might help. He turned to Rosalie, who stood quietly by the wash basin. Your mama ever mention an Osage woman named Sousa, Aunt Sousa Tallgrass? Rosalie's brow furrowed in concentration. I think so. She used to visit before... Her voice trailed off, and she absently rubbed her wrist where rope marks had once been. Lives up at the reservation agency, about 10 miles north, Eli said. If anyone can speak to your bloodline, it'd be her. Woman's got a memory sharp as a hawk's eye when it comes to family lines. That evening, they prepared for the journey. Eli packed cornmeal, dried beans, and salt pork into his saddlebags, along with extra blankets and his worn Bible. Rosalie helped, her movements becoming more confident with each passing day. Dawn broke crisp and clear the next morning. Eli hitched the mule to the cart while Rosalie filled their water skins at the well. The summer sun had barely cleared the horizon when they set out, the cart's wheels crunching over rocky ground. The terrain grew rougher as they headed north. Eli guided the mule carefully around jutting rocks and through patches of scrub brush. Rosalie held tight to the seat, but her eyes were bright with interest as she took in the changing landscape. Mama used to sing when we traveled, she said suddenly, breaking the morning silence. Songs in the old language. I only remember pieces now. Eli glanced at her, noting how the mention of her mother brought both pain and warmth to her face. What kind of songs? Morning songs, mostly, about the sun rising and birds waking up. Rosalie hummed a few notes, then stopped, embarrassed. There were stories too, but they're all mixed up in my head now. Tell me what you remember, Eli encouraged, steering the mule around a deep rut in the trail. Rosalie was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. There was one about a rabbit who tricked the sun into sharing its warmth with the moon, and another about how the prairie dogs learned to dig their towns underground. She smiled faintly. Mama said our people had stories for everything, every animal, every star, every change in the wind. They stopped at midday to rest the mule and eat some cornbread. The sun beat down mercilessly, but Eli found a spot of shade beneath a lonely cottonwood. As they ate, he pointed out tracks in the dust. Deer, coyote, jackrabbit, teaching Rosalie to read the story they told. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered in the western sky. Eli found a sheltered spot near a dry creek bed to make camp, showing Rosalie how to gather stones for a fire ring. She proved a quick study, arranging kindling just as he'd demonstrated. As darkness fell, they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread warmed over the flames. Eli brought out the Bible, and Rosalie carefully sounded out the words she'd been learning, her finger tracing each line in the firelight. "The Lord is my shepherd," she read slowly. "I shall not want." She paused, looking up at Eli. "What does want mean here?" "Means you won't be lacking for anything you need," he explained, adding another stick to the fire. "That the Lord provides." Rosalie considered this, the flames casting flickering shadows across her face. "Like you did? With the cage?" Eli's throat tightened. "Reckon so," he managed, "though I ain't nothing special, just trying to do what's right." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire. A coyote called in the distance, and another answered. "Will Aunt Susa help us?" Rosalie asked finally, her voice small against the vast darkness beyond their camp. "She's a proud woman, and she holds tight to the old ways," Eli said, "but she believes in justice, same as I do. If anyone can prove your claim to your mama's land, it's her." Rosalie nodded, pulling her blanket closer around her shoulders. The fire cast a warm glow across their small camp, a beacon of hope in the gathering night. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now they had found a moment of peace under the star-filled sky. The reservation agency came into view as the summer sun climbed high overhead. 2 army guards stood at attention near the wooden gate, their blue uniforms stark against the weathered posts. Eli pulled the mule cart to a stop, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Name's Eli Booker, here to see Aunt Susa Tallgrass on a matter of tribal records." The guards exchanged glances, rifles held ready but not aimed. The older of the two stepped forward. "State your business with the elder." "Matter of family lineage," Eli replied evenly. "Got papers need witnessing." He gestured to Rosalie, who sat straight-backed beside him, her hands folded in her lap. "This here's her kin we're looking to prove." After a long moment, the younger guard nodded toward a cluster of buildings. "Third house down, yellow curtains, don't make trouble." Eli guided the cart through the gate. Curious faces peered from doorways and windows as they passed. Children stopped their play to stare. Rosalie's shoulders tensed, but she kept her chin up, just as Eli had taught her. They found Aunt Susa's house easily enough, a neat wooden structure with faded yellow curtains fluttering in the windows. Before Eli could knock, the door swung open. Aunt Susa stood in the doorway, her silver hair bound in a long braid, her dark eyes sharp and questioning. The moment she saw Rosalie, her expression shifted. "Sweet Jesus," she breathed, one hand rising to her throat. "You're Sarah's girl?" Rosalie's eyes widened. "You knew my mama?" "Knew her? Child, I helped bring you into this world. Aunt Sousa stepped onto her porch, her keen gaze taking in every detail of Rosalie's face. Got her cheekbones, her way of holding herself. Come in, both of you. This is not talk for open air. Inside, the house smelled of sage and wood smoke. Aunt Sousa gestured them to sit at a worn table while she bustled about putting on water for tea. Been wondering when someone would come asking after Sarah's papers, she said, setting out tin cups. Didn't expect it'd be a mountain man bringing her own flesh and blood. Eli explained their situation. The guardianship, the land claim, Elder Graves's challenge. Aunt Sousa listened intently, her expression growing darker with each detail. 3 days to prove lineage, is it? She snorted. Graves knows exactly where those papers are. Railroad company took them during the last treaty discussions. Never gave them back, neither. She turned to a cedar chest in the corner, retrieving something wrapped in cloth. But I got something else. Something Sarah left with me just in case. She unwrapped a beautifully woven sash, its patterns telling stories in threads of blue and red and gold. This here's your mother's ceremonial sash. Shows her family line, clear as any paper document. Sarah knew those railroad men couldn't be trusted. Asked me to keep this safe. Rosalie touched the sash reverently, tracing the intricate patterns with trembling fingers. Aunt Sousa draped it across the girl's shoulders, murmuring words in Osage. You wear this proud, child. It's your birthright. They shared a simple meal of corn soup and fry bread, while Aunt Sousa recounted her memories of Sarah, how she'd fought to keep her land when the railroad came through, how she'd documented everything meticulously. Those papers are in the railroad's vault in town, she said firmly, locked up with all the other inconvenient treaties and deeds. Dark clouds were gathering as Eli and Rosalie prepared to leave. Aunt Sousa pressed a small packet of herbs into Rosalie's hands. For tea, she explained. Your mama's favorite blend. And tell Graves, her voice hardened, that Sousa Tallgrass is coming to town. He'll know what that means. Thunder rumbled in the distance as they started back toward Sagebrush Flats. Rosalie sat straighter in the cart, one hand resting on her mother's sash, her expression thoughtful but determined. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and sage. Eli? Rosalie's voice was quiet but steady. What do we do now? Eli clicked to the mule, urging it faster as the storm approached. Now we find those papers, he said grimly, and we show Graves and his council exactly who they're dealing with. Lightning split the sky ahead of them, illuminating the path home. The storm was rising, but so was their hope. They had proof of Rosalie's heritage, and more importantly, they knew where to find the documents that would secure her claim. The road ahead would not be easy, but at least now they knew which direction to take. Thunder cracked overhead as Eli guided the mule cart down Sagebrush Flats' muddy main street. Rain pelted the canvas cover, drumming a steady rhythm above their heads. Through the downpour, the railroad depot's windows glowed like distant beacons. There he is, Eli murmured, nodding toward a slight figure huddled beneath the depot's wooden awning. Ezra Thompson shifted from foot to foot, his clerk's vest buttoned tight against the wind. His eyes darted nervously as they approached. Eli helped Rosalie down from the cart, keeping his voice low. Mr. Thompson's got a conscience, unlike most working for the railroad. Reckon that's why he agreed to help? They hurried through the rain to join Thompson under the awning. Water dripped from the clerk's wire-rimmed spectacles as he wrung his hands. Mr. Booker, I could lose my position for this, he whispered, glancing over his shoulder at the empty street. The company doesn't take kindly to unauthorized access. Appreciate the risk you're taking, Eli said quietly. He gestured to Rosalie, who stood wrapped in her mother's ceremonial sash. But this here's about making right what was done wrong. Thompson's gaze softened as he looked at Rosalie. Yes, well, he fumbled with a ring of keys. The night watchman makes his rounds every hour. We'll have 20 minutes at most. The depot's back door creaked as Thompson unlocked it. They slipped inside, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. Oil lamps cast yellow circles on the walls as Thompson led them down a narrow hallway lined with filing cabinets. "The vault's through here," Thompson whispered, selecting another key. "Treaty documents are filed by date and territory." The heavy door swung open with a groan. Rosalie stayed close to Eli as they entered the cramped room. Metal shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, crammed with leather-bound ledgers and document boxes. The air smelled of dust and old paper. Thompson ran his finger along a row of spines, muttering to himself, "Summer of 1872? Osage Territory negotiations?" He pulled out a thick ledger, setting it carefully on a small desk. "Here, this should contain the original documentation." Eli struck a match, lighting an extra lamp as Thompson began turning pages. Rosalie leaned forward, her breath catching as familiar names appeared in flowing script. "There," Thompson said suddenly, pointing to an entry. "Sarah Whitefeather, grant of stewardship for 160 acres, including water rights to Bear Creek." His finger traced the carefully drawn map beside the entry. "The land matches your claim exactly." Rosalie touched her mother's name reverently. "That's really her." "Indeed, and look here." Thompson turned another page, revealing a detailed family lineage. "Your birth is recorded as well. This proves everything." A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. They froze. The lamp flame wavered as shadows moved past the frosted glass window in the door. "The watchman's early," Thompson hissed, fumbling for paper and pencil. "Quick, copy what we need." Eli's hands were steady as he sketched the map and wrote down the essential details. Rosalie helped Thompson return the ledger to its exact spot, while rain hammered against the windows. Another creak, closer now. "Back door," Thompson breathed, gesturing urgently. "I'll make sure everything's in place." They crept down the hallway, Eli clutching the copied documents inside his coat. The rain had intensified, turning the street into a river of mud. Thunder boomed as they reached the mule cart. "Much obliged," Eli called softly to Thompson, who stood watching from the doorway. The clerk gave a quick nod before disappearing inside. As Eli helped Rosalie into the cart, a match flared in an upstairs window of the Mercantile across the street. A face appeared briefly in the lamplight. Elder Graves, his expression hard as stone. "Hold tight," Eli murmured, snapping the reins. The mules splashed through puddles as they made their way out of town. Lightning illuminated the angry faces watching from windows and doorways. Rosalie clutched her mother's sash with one hand and gripped the seat with the other. "They saw us, didn't they?" "They did." Eli kept his voice calm, but his eyes scanned the darkness ahead. "And they won't take kindly to what we found." The storm raged around them as they rode toward the line shack, but the precious documents were safe and dry inside Eli's coat. They had their proof now, but they'd also shown their hand. The real fight was just beginning. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pearl and gold as Eli and Rosalie made their way back to the line shack. The morning air still held the dampness from last night's storm, and puddles dotted the rutted trail. Their mule plodded steadily forward, ears twitching at distant sounds. Rosalie clutched the copied documents, now safely wrapped in oilcloth. "Look there," she said, pointing ahead. "Is that smoke?" Eli's weathered face tightened. Through the early morning haze, dark smoke billowed above the tree line where his line shack stood. He snapped the reins, urging the mule to move faster. As they crested the last rise, flames engulfed the small cabin. 3 men in railroad company coats were mounting up, their horses dancing nervously in the firelight. One man turned, and even at this distance, the brass star on his chest identified Deputy Klein. "Stay here," Eli ordered, jumping down from the cart, but Rosalie was already scrambling after him. "That's everything we own," she cried. The heat hit them like a wall as they approached. Flames roared through the roof, consuming the rough-hewn logs. Through the open doorway, they could see Eli's few possessions burning: the table where Rosalie had practiced her letters, the shelf of carefully preserved food, the worn Bible they'd read together. Eli grabbed a bucket from the cart and ran to the well. "Help me," he shouted. Together, they worked the pump handle, but it was already too late. The fire had too strong a hold. Rosalie spotted something flutter from the doorway, a half-burned page from their Bible. She snatched it up, then another, and another. Most were too charred to read, but she salvaged what she could. The crash of the roof falling in made them both jump back. Sparks spiraled upward like angry fireflies. Eli's shoulders slumped as he watched 15 years of careful building disappear into ash. "We need to get to town," he said grimly. "It ain't safe here." They had barely turned the cart around when hoofbeats thundered toward them. Deputy Klein led a group of men, their faces hard with purpose. "Eli Booker," Klein's voice carried across the crackling of flames. "You're under arrest for theft of railroad property and suspected arson." "That's a lie." Rosalie stepped forward, but Eli put a restraining hand on her arm. "Easy now," he murmured. "Don't give them reason." Two men dismounted, roughly grabbing Eli's arms. Klein produced a pair of iron handcuffs that gleamed dully in the morning light. "We got witnesses saw you and the girl sneaking around the depot last night," Klein said, snapping the cuffs closed. "And now your shack catches fire? Mighty suspicious timing." "You know who really set this fire?" Eli's voice was quiet, but firm. "Same ones who've been trying to bury the truth about Rosalie's claim." Klein's face darkened. "That's enough out of you." He turned to his men. "Get him on his horse. Girl comes with us too." The ride into town was tense and silent. Rosalie's mind raced, watching Eli straight back ahead of her as he rode between two guards. The copied documents were still safe, hidden in her skirts, but without Eli's protection, what chance did she have? Townspeople gathered to watch as they passed. Some looked away, shamefaced, while others whispered behind their hands. Near the jail, Preacher McKinley stepped forward from the crowd. "I'll take the girl," he announced firmly. "My wife and I will see she's cared for proper." Deputy Klein hesitated, then nodded curtly. "Fine, but she stays in town where we can watch her." Eli turned in his saddle. "Rosalie," he called softly. Their eyes met, and in that moment, she saw not defeat, but determination in his gaze. The jail door clanged shut behind Eli with terrible finality. Rosalie followed Preacher McKinley to his modest home, where his wife Sarah waited with concerned eyes and open arms. That evening, after a quiet supper, Rosalie sat in the preacher's small study. Through the window, she could see the jail across the street. A single lamp burned in its window. Her fingers traced the singed edges of the Bible pages she'd rescued. The words were barely legible, but one verse stood out: "Be strong and of good courage." She touched her mother's sash, remembering Eli's quiet strength as he'd taught her to read, to draw water, to stand tall. He'd given her back her dignity when others had tried to cage her like an animal. "I won't let them win," she whispered fiercely. "I won't let them steal my future or leave you to rot in that cell." The setting sun painted the jail walls blood red. In its light, Rosalie's shadow stretched long across the preacher's floor. No longer the shadow of a frightened girl, but of a woman ready to fight for what was right. Morning sunlight streamed through the church's stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across the wooden pews. Rosalie stood at the back of the sanctuary, her heart hammering against her ribs as she watched the congregation file in for Sunday service. The familiar faces that had once jeered at her now turned away uncomfortably or stared with undisguised curiosity. Preacher McKinley's wife gave Rosalie's hand a gentle squeeze. "Remember," she whispered, "just speak from your heart." The service began as usual, with hymns and prayers. Then Preacher McKinley stepped to the pulpit, his weathered face solemn. "Brothers and sisters, before we continue, there's someone who needs to be heard." someone whose story speaks to the very heart of Christian charity and justice. He gestured to Rosalie, who rose on trembling legs. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way to the front. She clutched her mother's woven sash like a lifeline. Her voice cracked. She swallowed hard and started again. I know most of you only know me as the girl in the cage, the one you threw scraps at like an animal. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But I'm more than that. My mother was Sarah Tallfeather, an Osage woman who loved this land. Rosalie's voice grew stronger as she spoke of her mother's gentle hands, her songs in the twilight, the stories she told of their people's connection to the earth. Then she described the day the railroad men came, how they took her mother's papers, how she disappeared soon after. Her voice broke as she recounted the years of abuse at her father's hands, the humiliation of being displayed like a sideshow attraction. Mr. Booker showed me kindness when no one else would, she said. Now he's in jail because he helped me find the truth about my mother's claim, about papers the railroad took and hid away. Mrs. Peterson, who ran the general store, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Old Tom Wheeler, the blacksmith, stared at his hands, his face troubled. Even Elder Graves's wife looked shaken. I ain't asking for your pity, Rosalie continued. I'm asking for your help to make things right, to show that Sagebrush Flats stands for justice, not just for some, but for all. When she finished, silence filled the church. Then Mrs. Peterson stood up. I remember your mother, she said softly. She used to trade the finest beadwork for supplies. I never knew what happened to her. Others began to nod, memories stirring of a gentle woman who had been part of their community before the railroad came. Preacher McKinley returned to the pulpit. Friends, we need to face this truth together. I'm calling a town meeting tomorrow evening. Every soul in Sagebrush Flats deserves to hear the full story. After the service, Mr. Thompson approached Rosalie, his clerk's spectacles glinting in the sunlight. I've been talking to folks, he said quietly. There are others who've seen the railroad's strong-arm tactics. The livery stable owner, 3 farmers who lost land, even the telegraph operator. They're willing to speak up now. Rosalie nodded, hope rising in her chest. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. The preacher's wife helped Rosalie draft a formal appeal to the circuit judge that afternoon. They carefully detailed the evidence, Aunt Susan's testimony, the copied ledger entries, the pattern of intimidation. Mr. Thompson took it to the telegraph office himself, tapping out the urgent message to the county seat 20 miles away. As dusk settled over the town, Rosalie stood in the preacher's study, watching lamplight flicker in the jail window across the street. For the first time since Eli's arrest, she felt the weight on her shoulders lighten slightly. She wasn't alone anymore. Mrs. McKinley appeared at her elbow with a cup of tea. You did a brave thing today, she said softly. I was terrified, Rosalie admitted. That's what makes it brave. The older woman smiled. Fear didn't stop you from speaking truth. Through the window, they could see people still gathered in small groups on the street, talking in low voices. The ripples of Rosalie's testimony spread through the town like waves on a pond, touching consciences, awakening memories, stirring up questions too long buried. In the jail across the way, a shadow moved past the barred window. Eli, pacing his cell. Rosalie pressed her hand against the cool glass, remembering his words about mercy not demanding payment. Today, she had taken another step toward proving him right, toward becoming someone who could stand tall and speak truth to power. The town of Sagebrush Flats would gather tomorrow to hear the full story. But tonight, something had already shifted. In the hearts of the townspeople, seeds of compassion and justice had been planted, waiting to take root and grow. The afternoon sun cast iron bar shadows across the jail's dirt floor. Eli sat on his narrow cot, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The cell was barely big enough to take 3 steps in any direction, and the summer heat made the confined space feel even smaller. Through the barred window, he heard familiar footsteps approaching. Rosalie appeared, her face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Booker?" she called softly. "Things are changing. I spoke at church this morning." Eli moved to the window, his chains clinking. "Did you now?" Pride warmed his voice. "Tell me everything." Rosalie described the congregation's reaction, how Mrs. Peterson had remembered her mother, and how Mr. Thompson was gathering witnesses against the railroad. With each word, her confidence seemed to grow stronger. "People are starting to listen," she said. "Really listen. Even some who used to throw things at my cage." Eli's weathered face creased with concern. "That's good news, child. But watch yourself. Elder Graves won't take kindly to losing his grip on folks' minds." "I ain't afraid of him anymore," Rosalie said, standing straighter. "The preacher's wife helped me send a telegram to the circuit judge. We wrote down everything. Aunt Susan's testimony, the railroad papers, all of it." Eli nodded slowly. "Keep pushing, girl. Truth's like water. It finds a way through even the hardest stone." He reached through the bars to pat her hand. "You're doing right." The afternoon brought the sound of hoofbeats on the packed dirt of Main Street. The circuit judge, a lean man named Harrison, rode into town with his clerk trailing behind. They caused quite a stir, especially when the judge headed straight for the preacher's house where Rosalie was staying. Elder Graves burst into the preacher's parlor just as Judge Harrison was reviewing the telegram and supporting documents. The banker's face was red with indignation. "Your Honor, this is an outrage," Graves sputtered. "These people are trying to undermine the proper order of things. That girl has no standing to—" Judge Harrison held up one hand, silencing him. "Mr. Graves, I've received serious allegations of document theft, intimidation, and unlawful imprisonment. This young woman's tribal claim predates the railroad's grants." He adjusted his spectacles. "I'm calling a formal hearing tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock sharp. But Your Honor—" "This isn't a debate, Mr. Graves." The judge's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "I suggest you prepare your arguments for the proper time and place." After Graves stormed out, the judge turned to Rosalie. "Young lady, I knew your mother's people. The Osage have suffered enough broken promises. Tomorrow we'll see justice done properly." As evening settled over Sagebrush Flats, Rosalie made her way back to the jail. The guard, softened by the day's events, allowed her to sit by Eli's window. Together, they watched the sun paint the western sky in shades of purple and gold. "Time for evening prayers," Eli said quietly. He had been teaching Rosalie from his worn Bible, helping her sound out the words that brought them both comfort. Rosalie pulled the small book from her apron pocket. In the fading light, she carefully opened to Psalm 23, the first passage she had learned to read. "The Lord is my shepherd," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I shall not want." Eli's deep voice joined hers, their words mingling through the iron bars. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." As they prayed, something settled in Rosalie's heart, a peace that went beyond their difficult circumstances. She understood now why Eli had risked everything to help her. It wasn't just about land claims or water rights. It was about seeing the worth in someone when they couldn't see it in themselves. "You taught me more than just reading, Mr. Booker," she said, after they finished praying. "You showed me I was somebody worth fighting for." Eli's calloused hand reached through the bars to rest on her shoulder. "You always were, child. You just needed reminding." His voice was rough with emotion. "Whatever happens tomorrow, hold on to that truth." The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and the distant cry of a lone coyote. In that moment, their shared faith and determination bridged the iron bars between them, strengthening their resolve for the battle ahead. Through the gathering dusk, they could see lights being lit in windows across town. Tomorrow would bring the hearing that would decide not just Rosalie's future, but the conscience of Sagebrush Flats itself. For now, though, they had this moment of peace. their prayers rising like smoke signals into the darkening sky. The town hall had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom, with every wooden bench packed tight. Morning sunlight filtered through dusty windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Rosalie sat beside Eli, who remained in shackles but held his head high. The air was thick with tension and the murmur of whispered conversations. Judge Harrison took his place at the front table, arranging his papers with deliberate care. "This hearing will come to order," he announced, his voice cutting through the chatter. "We're here to examine the validity of Miss Rosalie's tribal land claim and the charges against Mr. Booker." Elder Graves sat with the railroad's attorney, a sharp-featured man named Mr. Preston. They shuffled through their documents, exchanging confident glances. The banker's usual pious expression had hardened into something closer to contempt. Preston rose first, straightening his vest. "Your Honor, we intend to prove that this individual," he gestured dismissively toward Rosalie, "is manifestly unfit for land stewardship. One need only look at her physical appearance to see clear signs of degeneracy, and—" The judge's gavel cracked like thunder. "Mr. Preston, this court will not entertain personal attacks or prejudiced assertions. Present your evidence or sit down." Preston sputtered, his face reddening. "But, Your Honor, surely you can see—" "What I see," Judge Harrison interrupted, "is an attorney attempting to substitute insults for legal arguments. One more such comment, and I'll find you in contempt. Now, do you have actual evidence to present?" The railroad's attorney deflated visibly. We have concerns about the authenticity of the claimed documentation." "Then let's examine that documentation." The judge turned to where Aunt Susa sat, dignified in her traditional dress. "Madam, please approach and share your testimony." Aunt Susa walked forward, her bearing regal despite her age. She spoke clearly, her words carrying to every corner of the room. "I knew Rosalie's mother, Sarah Tallgrass. We were sisters in the ways of our people. Before she died, Sarah entrusted me with knowledge of the treaties and water rights that belonged to her family line." The elder's testimony continued, weaving together family histories and land agreements with precise detail. She named dates, locations, and witnesses, many still living. Her memory proved unassailable, and her dignity silenced even the most skeptical observers. "The railroad men came with papers," Aunt Susa recalled. "They took our documents for safekeeping during negotiations. Those papers were never returned." Mr. Thompson stepped forward next, his clerk's ledger clutched tightly. "Your Honor, I can confirm the existence of those original documents. They were stored in the railroad company's vault." He presented the copied records, his hands trembling slightly. These show clearly that Rosalie's mother held valid title to the contested lands and water rights. Judge Harrison examined the copies carefully. "These appear to be properly recorded and witnessed." He looked up at Elder Graves. "Would you care to explain why these documents were concealed?" Graves shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, in times of progress, certain accommodations must be made for the greater good of—" "The greater good does not justify theft or fraud, sir." The judge's words fell like hammer blows. "Nor does it excuse the wrongful imprisonment of an innocent man or the shameful treatment of this young woman." The townspeople stirred, many nodding in agreement. The preacher's wife reached over to squeeze Rosalie's hand. Even Deputy Klein looked ashamed, his badge suddenly seeming to weigh heavily on his chest. Judge Harrison shuffled his papers decisively. "Having reviewed all evidence presented, this court finds as follows. First, all charges against Eli Booker are dismissed. Remove those shackles immediately." The deputy hurried to comply as the judge continued. "Second, Rosalie's tribal claim to the contested lands and water rights is hereby upheld, with full recognition of her mother's original title." He fixed Elder Graves with a stern look. "Furthermore, this court strongly suggests the railroad company make restitution for its unlawful seizure of tribal documents." Graves slumped in his seat, his face ashen. The railroad attorney gathered his papers in defeat, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Finally, the judge added, "Let the record show that this court condemns the treatment Miss Rosalie has endured. A community is judged not by its prosperity, but by how it treats its most vulnerable members." The room erupted in relieved conversation. Eli, now free of his chains, wrapped Rosalie in a protective embrace as tears of joy rolled down her cheeks. Aunt Susa approached them, her eyes bright with triumph. "Your mother would be proud," she told Rosalie softly. "You stood tall when they tried to make you small." Thompson watched from nearby, a slight smile on his usually anxious face. Around them, townspeople who had once jeered now came forward to offer congratulations and awkward apologies. The morning sun streamed brighter through the windows, as if nature itself was celebrating justice finally served. The autumn air carried the sharp ring of hammers and the sweet scent of fresh-cut pine. Where Eli's burned line shack had stood, a new structure rose day by day. Preacher McKinley's congregation had turned out in force, bringing tools and willing hands. Even those who'd once turned away now came bearing gifts of labor and friendship. Rosalie moved among the workers with quiet authority, her head held high. Gone was the frightened girl who'd arrived in a cage. In her place stood a young woman who knew her own worth. She directed the placement of floor joists and helped raise wall frames, her strength no longer a source of shame, but an asset in the rebuilding. "The roof beam needs to cant a bit more to shed the winter snow," she instructed two men struggling with a heavy timber. They nodded respectfully, adjusting their grip to follow her guidance. Eli watched from the shade of a cottonwood tree, pride warming his weathered face. He'd taught her what he could about building, but her natural intelligence had taken those lessons and run with them. Now she was teaching others. The women from town had set up a cooking station, with stews and cornbread feeding the hungry workers. The same hands that had once thrown scraps at her now offered fresh-baked biscuits and preserves. Sarah Miller, the banker's wife, approached Rosalie with a basket of dried apples. "For your pantry," she said softly. "And I'm sorry for before." Rosalie accepted both the gift and the apology with grace. "Thank you. Will you join us for the water rights meeting tomorrow?" Word had spread about Rosalie's plan to ensure fair water access for every family in the valley. Even Elder Graves had requested to attend, his former arrogance replaced by necessity and humility. The next morning, Rosalie sat at the head of the preacher's kitchen table. Land documents spread before her. Elder Graves sat opposite, his usual fine suit looking somehow diminished. "These are the terms," Rosalie explained, her voice clear and steady. "Every family gets water rights based on their needs, not their wealth. The fees will be fair, and no one goes without." Graves studied the papers, then looked up at the young woman he'd once dismissed. "You could demand much more. You could even force us out." "That's not the way of my mother's people," Rosalie replied. "The water belongs to all of us. We just have to learn to share it right." Eli leaned against the doorframe, his chest tight with emotion. He remembered the trembling girl he'd found in that cage, and marveled at how far she'd come. She didn't need his protection anymore. She had found her own strength, and in doing so, had taught the whole town about dignity and grace. The setting sun painted long shadows across the newly laid floorboards of the rebuilt homestead. Rosalie struck a match, its brief flare illuminating her face as she lit the glass lantern. With deliberate care, she placed it in the front window, its warm glow spilling out into the gathering dusk. "Just like you showed me that first night," she said to Eli, adjusting the flame's height. "Reckon you do it better than I ever did," he replied, his gruff voice softened by pride. "That light'll guide any lost soul home." They settled at their sturdy new table, steam rising from bowls of bean soup and a fresh loaf of bread. Eli's calloused hands clasped Rosalie's as they bowed their heads for grace. "Lord," Rosalie began, her voice steady and clear, We thank you for unlikely family, for second chances, and for the peace you've brought to this valley. Help us be worthy of these blessings. Amen, Eli echoed, his eyes misty. The quiet of their meal was broken by approaching hoofbeats. Preacher McKinley's familiar silhouette appeared at the door, and Rosalie welcomed him in with a smile. "Something smells mighty fine in here," the preacher said, accepting their invitation to sit. His weathered face creased with joy as he shared his news. "The church council met today. We've decided to dig a new well in town, dedicated to the memory of your mother, Rosalie. A testament to her wisdom about sharing the water, and to remind us all that mercy flows deeper than judgment." Rosalie's hands trembled slightly as she poured the preacher a cup of coffee. "She would have liked that," she said softly. "She always said water was life's greatest gift, meant for all God's children." After the preacher bid them good night, Rosalie stepped out onto the fresh-hewn porch. The evening air carried the scent of sage and late summer flowers. Stars were beginning to pierce the darkening sky, and a chorus of crickets filled the peaceful darkness. She drew in a deep breath, remembering the suffocating confines of the cage that had once been her prison. But that girl, the one they'd mocked and branded as nothing more than the hog maid, was gone. In her place stood a woman who knew her true worth, who had found her voice and her purpose. The lantern's glow behind her cast her shadow long across the yard, no longer a shape of shame, but one of dignity. She was Rosalie, daughter of an Osage mother, steward of the land, and keeper of the water that gave life to all. And she was home. If this one resonated with you, stick around. I've got another story waiting for you tomorrow, and who knows, it might be just what you needed to hear.